This is Jim Cantelon Today Television, Bible study for the 21st century. So friends, we're at it again, and welcome. We're slowly working our way through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. And we're just now about to read some of the 5th chapter of John. If you have a Bible, turn to it and you kind of follow along while I'm going through it slowly. It's a terrific chapter, and so much to learn from this, even as there was in chapter 4. So we'll get to it right after this.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows is a trusted Christian charity reaching out to the sick and the dying, the least of these in pandemic-stricken Africa and India. For over 22 years, Jim and Kathy Cantelon have engaged with community-based champions and church volunteers in the care for those whom Jim calls society's weakest link. Everything from home-based palliative care to the rescue and protection of young women and girls who are victims of abuse is done in the name of Jesus and is overseen by local partner champions and an army of church-based volunteers. WOW has a proven track record. Check it out on wowmission.com, or if you wish, you can call or write to us. Its sustainability is dependent on the support of faithful friends like you.
Well, friends, we are making huge progress. We're in John chapter 5, and this is a fascinating chapter. It really is. I like this chapter for a number of reasons, one of them being that I can really relate to the Pool of Bethesda because I know it so well, or at least I know it as it is now, not how it was then. But let's read the first 15 verses of John 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, and one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else gets down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Now the day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you're well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who'd made him well. Okay, we'll stop there. I've noted several times over the course of 5 years of teaching through the Gospels that there were 3 major festivals, and there still are 3 major festivals in Israel, which all Israelite males at that time were required to attend. Passover in the spring, Pentecost in the early summer, Tabernacles in the early fall. And Jesus had been to Jerusalem for Passover that year, so sometime later here may refer to Pentecost, or Shavuot as it's called in Israel, and it occurred 50 days after Passover. That's why it's called Pentecost, Pente, 5, okay? So like the thousands of other pilgrims, Jesus visited various sites around the city, you can be sure. He just didn't stay in one spot. And this day, he went to the pool of Bethesda, just a few hundred feet north of the Temple Mount. And perhaps it was one of his favorite locations in that a multitude of the people he ministered to, invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed, and others were always there. Now, interestingly, there's a church built there now beside what was the pool. It's called the Church of St. Anne, built by the Crusaders a number of centuries ago. And it's one of my favorite sites in Jerusalem. I'll tell you why. First of all, as I say, it's built adjacent to the pool of Bethesda. And by the way, in the Hebrew, it's Bethsatha. Okay, Bethesda is Aramaic. Bethsatha is closer to the Hebrew, but it has this church has the finest acoustics of any church I've visited anywhere. In fact, you can Google Church of St. Anne, Jerusalem, and you'll see a picture of it. It's very spare. There's nothing Gothic about it, nothing highly decorated about it. It's very, very plain stone building, but there's a huge dome in the church, and the acoustics are just phenomenal. I've many times brought small groups in there. You have 15, 20 people, and you sing a favorite hymn, and it sounds like the choirs of heaven are singing. It's absolutely amazing. And when you stand in the courtyard outside of the church, you look down into the ruins of a basilica or two over the centuries that were built beside the pool. And the depression itself is fairly steep, and there's very little water. There is water, but very little water there today. Now, most cisterns and urban pools in Jerusalem in Jesus' day were cut out of the rock and fed by hewn channels. It's fascinating. You sort of have to get beyond the typical tour of Israel. You got to know where you're going. But in that Bethesda area and the Antonia Fortress area, there on the northeast corner of the Temple Mount, there's all kinds of cisterns. I've been in several of them, but one I've been in that it's massive. It's like, maybe 40, 50 feet deep, high, and then maybe 100 feet wide. It's massive. And during the winter rains, the channels that have been cut through the living rock feed right into it, and it fills right up. And that's just one of several. The Garden Tomb, just outside the Damascus Gate, has a massive, massive cistern in it. I've been into it. Again, you got to know it's there. But it would fill with water. And there was so many cisterns that even during times of drought, there was always water for the city of Jerusalem, which is terrific. And when those failed, there was a tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel that went out underneath the wall of the old city to a spring at the Pool of Siloam. And it would, the Gihon Spring, which would fill the Pool of Siloam a little further down, but they were able to get the water up to the city from through those tunnels. Anyway, you can climb down into them. And in fact, Hezekiah's Tunnel, you can walk through it. You might be in 3 feet of water, but it's quite a thing. Anyhow, the Bethesda Pool was seen as a place of healing. John doesn't build any doctrine about this. There's no theology about this. But historically, for centuries, it had been seen as a place of healing. And so there was this expectation that if you could get down to the Pool of Bethesda, it was a healing atmosphere, if you will. And there was a sense that from time to time the water would be disturbed. John doesn't say how or why, but it would be disturbed. If you get in the water when it was being disturbed, either by wind or by supernatural intervention, whatever, your chances of being healed were much greater. And so here's a guy, 38 years there, and when the pool is disturbed, he can't get to it. He's probably paralytic. He just can't make it. So Jesus comes along and asks him a fairly obvious question. Do you want to be better? Hello? Yes? So Jesus says, okay, just stand up, take your mat, away you go. And that's exactly what happened. You can be sure the guy was stunned. We talk sometimes about jet lag, when you fly through various time zones and it takes you a day or two, in the haze of it all to kind of find your equilibrium. Can you imagine this guy? This would be jet lag. This would be healing lag. I mean, 38 years not able to walk, and now suddenly he's just up, carrying his mat, walking, no problem. Some of the religious leaders, the Pharisees in this case, saw him carrying his mat. And this was verboten. This was forbidden on the Sabbath. To carry anything on the Sabbath was forbidden. There was an oral tradition, you can Google Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H, which goes kind of the precursor of the Talmud, which was written over the course of 400 years in Babylon and also in Caesarea and Tiberias. But it was the oral law, the oral tradition. It was the rabbinic attempt to build what they called a fence around the law of Moses, so that it would keep you from even trespassing the potential of sinning against the law of Moses. It would protect you from it. And so they were very, very exact, very legalistic, very demanding. And one of those laws, or many of those laws actually related to the Sabbath. It's fascinating. I've done this. You go to the Talmud and read about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, and it's just overwhelming. Well, one of the little laws in there was about carrying things on the Sabbath day. This guy's carrying his mat. These ultra, Orthodox, Pharisaical leaders immediately find fault with him. They don't know he's just been healed. They just see him carrying his mat. And they go up to him and they scold him for it. No carrying of burdens allowed on the Sabbath. And on top of that, you're in the Temple Mount area, which, quadruples your sin. Well, yes, this newly healed guy was in violation of that law. He didn't really know it. Maybe he was in a fog, so amazed that he could walk. Who knows? So they accost him with his offense, but he basically sidesteps it by saying, well, don't blame me. The man who healed me told me to pick up my mat and walk. Well, really? Who's he? He couldn't name him. Jesus had not introduced himself. He not cared to ask. So the accusers move on. I mean, they can't throw the guy in jail, but they've made their point. They catch up with him later when he's in the temple, maybe with a thank offering for his healing. And by then, he's able to tell them who it was who healed him. And this was, if you will, the first of many what's called Sabbath controversies in the New Testament. And I'll get into that Sabbath controversy and the very important concept of Sabbath right after this break. Don't go away.
For over 20 years, WOW, working for orphans and widows, has been caring for vulnerable and at-risk women and children hard hit by the HIV and AIDS pandemic in Africa and India. WOW engages with local partner champions and church-based volunteers in the care of the desperately needy. Now, in recent months, we have expanded our reach to Ukraine. Over 8 million refugees have fled the ravages of that war-torn country, mostly women and children, including many orphans. Our partner in East Europe tells us of the busing of Ukrainian orphans through the night to safety. Churches have become refugee centers, opening their buildings to become safe havens in the rescue. And WOW has come alongside. We have begun supporting this rescue work, but there is so much more that we must provide to these heroic churches. They need funding to continue for hundreds of orphans yet to come. We may be only small players, but you can partner with us in the rescue of Ukrainian orphans. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So this wonderful moment for this paralytic is somewhat conditioned negatively by this encounter with these self-righteous religious Pharisees. But nevertheless, he takes this thank offering to the temple, and his accusers who had left him with their scold, they find him again, and this time he tells them who it was that healed him. He said, this guy called Jesus. And what's interesting about that is that Jesus didn't seek any glory in any of this. He didn't say, now, here's my card, give it to the Pharisees. He just took this as a kind of a casual matter of course. Interesting, though, he did say to the guy, because he caught up with him at the temple as well, he says, look, sin no more that nothing worse befall you. That's verse 14 of chapter 5. It's interesting. Jesus said much the same to a young paralytic that he heals in Capernaum. He says it to the woman caught in adultery. Go and sin no more. You see, in the Jewish view, there was a connection between sinful behavior and adversity, whether it was, adversity vis-a-vis bad health or adversity in terms of accident or unexpected calamity. The view was that this has come upon you because you've sinned. And again, there's no attempt to theologically parse that or come up with reasons why, to rationalize it. It just was the view. And Jesus says to him, sin no more that nothing worse may befall you. So this fellow that Jesus had healed may or may not have been dealing with long-term guilt over some spiritually eviscerating transgression. Could very well be that he'd been living with regret, with guilt. Who knows? John doesn't tell us. But Jesus saw a connection and warned him against recidivism, falling back, backsliding into the old ways. And then he basically just goes his way, but Jesus left his name with him, and the man immediately finds his accusers and tells them that's him right there. I think he was still trying to pass the buck in terms of the blame that they were accusing him of carrying something on the Sabbath. Let me talk about Sabbath, or as we call it in Israel, Shabbat. This goes right back to the creation narrative in Genesis. And after all of the creative energy that the Lord put out, he stopped. And the term used is he rested. That doesn't mean that he, got his pillow and laid down and had a sleep. It just simply rested, just simply means he stopped his creative activity at that point. That doesn't mean that he stopped being a creator, but in terms of his plan for the universe as it was known then and as we're knowing it increasingly now, there was no more to add, okay? So he stopped from that creative work. He rested from that creative work. Well, this became part and parcel of Israel's view of themselves. In fact, in the law, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In other words, you should rest too. And this was not a negative thing. This was everybody needs a break. That's basically what Shabbat means. Everybody needs a break. You work hard, and in those days, man, you work from sun up to sundown. You worked for very little. Life was very, very basic. If you made it to age 50, you were amazing. Life was tough. You needed one day a week where you could just back away from work, back away from the stress of making a living, and just recreate, okay? That's the meaning of recreation, recreate. And so that's essentially what's happening here. Now, God himself did not need to recreate, but he knew that his people would need to recreate. You got to have some rest. And you know this. If you work nonstop, 24/7, day after day, week after week, month after month, you're courting burnout. And a lot of you have been through that. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, we all need a Shabbat. Now, what's interesting, as this Shabbat tradition has become really a part of what it means to be Jewish, it has taken on some very significant and, in my view, very not just helpful, but inspiring characteristics. When I lived in Jerusalem, Kathy and I were there for 7 years, as you know. We raised our 3 kids there. invited by the Israeli government to plant a church in Jerusalem, which we did. It's now called King of Kings. You can Google it, King of Kings, Jerusalem. One of the things I loved about living in Jerusalem was Shabbat. Now here's what happens. For instance, I'm thinking right now about my office, which was right downtown. I was just around the corner from the Prime Minister's office. I used to see him once in a while out for a walk. He'd be out walking with a guard, and I'd be walking with no guard. And they knew that I was safe. They know everything about their neighbors. But on a Friday, 12:30, 1 o'clock, we were on a very busy corner. Traffic would start to thin, and it would get thinner and thinner and thinner. By 3:30, it was almost non-existent. You could almost hear Jerusalem exhale. By 4:30, there's hardly any traffic. There's what you do see are families walking to mom and dad's place, often in their Shabbat best, carrying some challah bread, maybe a glass, maybe a bottle of wine, and some flowers, and they're going to welcome the Sabbath. That's what Kabbalat Shabbat means. Welcome the Sabbath at their parents' home. Just before sunset, the woman of the house, she lights the Shabbat candles, and then you hear this big siren that you can hear all over Jerusalem. And what it does is it signals Shabbat has begun. And then you have the Shabbat meal. Now, I know this very well because we used to do Kabbalat Shabbat ourselves in our own home, even though we're Gentiles. But oftentimes we were invited to Israeli friends' homes, and we would go through the beautiful ceremony with them. The head of the house, the man of the house, stands at the end of the table. We're all seated there, and he lifts the bread, the challah bread, and he breaks it. And he says, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." He says it in Hebrew. And then he breaks off pieces, or he just hands the half to either side. It's passed around, everybody takes a chunk, okay? Then he takes a glass of wine. "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth fruit from the vine." Takes a little sip of it and passes it around. Everyone takes a little bit of wine. What does this remind you of, friends? You know, when Jesus celebrated the Seder, the Passover Seder, with the Shabbat ceremony, basically what he was saying is, this bread and this wine are trigger mechanisms for you. Every time you do this, I want you to remember me. He wasn't talking just about Passover. He was talking about Kabbalat Shabbat. Every Friday night, when you break the bread and bless it, when you pour the wine and bless it, remember me, will you? You know, this reflects not just the humanity of Christ, but also the deity of Christ. As a human, he did not want to be forgotten. Who of us wants to be forgotten? You want to be forgotten? I don't want to be forgotten. Okay? We're all concerned about a legacy, about those who follow us and their memories, you know, of grandma, grandpa, you know, of their ancestor, who happens to be us right now for those 4 and 5 generations down the line. But it also reflects the deity component in that when you read the Old Testament, you see again and again and again, God the Father speaking to Israel saying, remember me. You've forgotten me. You forgot that I delivered you from Egypt. You forgot that I fed you with manna through 40 years in the wilderness. You forgot that I brought water out of the rock. You forgot that I looked after you, that I oversaw you as a burgeoning nation when all the enemies around you wanted to destroy you. You forget. Now you're worshiping idols, and please remember me. We need to remember the Lord, friends. I'm launching into a sermon here, so I'll stop. But that's one of the things I just loved about Shabbat in Jerusalem. And then it's also interesting that Shabbat begins at sundown. Every new day in Israel begins at sundown. Monday begins sundown on Sunday night. Sunday begins sundown on Saturday night. A day goes from sundown to sundown. not from sunrise to sunrise. It goes from sundown to sundown. So on Saturday, when the sun is up, you're in the second half of Shabbat. And generally speaking, in Israel, certainly in Jerusalem, there's very little traffic. None of the stores are open. You can walk the streets with no concern about traffic. People are just sitting in their gardens, their gans as they're called, or on their mirpessets, their balconies. And you'll see family groupings all over the place, just enjoying one another, the children playing. And it's recreation time. It's Shabbat. It's a wonderful time, a time to be honored.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partnered champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and President Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
Friends, if you'd like a little bit more in-depth on the Gospels, I've written a book for you. It's called Cantelon's Casual Commentary, a 21st Century Guide to the Life of Jesus for the Internet Generation. It's a big work. It's 520 pages, but it really is a good companion. Everybody needs a good Bible commentary when you're studying the Scriptures, and I've done my best to help you. So you can Google it. It's all of the book retailers on the Internet have it available. Cantelon's Casual Commentary, and I spent a lot of time writing this for your benefit, and I'm hoping that you will benefit from it. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to add value to your spiritual growth and development, and that's just another little effort on my part to help you along in that wonderful adventure. So, thanks for watching, and we're going to see you again, God willing, next program. Until then, bye for now.